I'll just point out to everyone, I'm not a policeman now, I'm retired, yeah? So.
Yeah,
you can relax.
Information.
I'm not their favorite person at the moment, so.
I think, yeah, we are recording now, Nika.
Yes.
So I was thinking, Paul, because we spoke on the phone and you gave me a little bit of the insight from your experience, maybe you can give us some context, because I thought it was interesting what you said about how the structures and decision-making processes in police changed from when the Labour was in power to when the Tories came. So that would help with giving some context a little bit to the UK police and how they work.
Yeah, I would say probably. Well, I was on the murder squads when Labour were in power, New Labour, and Tony Blair was in power, and so Ian Blair was the commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, and they worked quite well together. And Sir Ian Blair was quite administrative, but he was obviously supportive of Labour policies, and neighbourhood policing was a big thing at that time. So if we were going to go into an estate, if there'd been a murder and we were trying to find out who had committed the murder, we would always have to go through the neighbourhood police, who would be patrolling the area. They would know all the gangs, they would know all the kids, they would know the families. And we were not allowed to do anything without talking to the neighbourhoods. So it was completely different. I mean, they had a place in the hierarchy, which was completely different to what it is today. Quite rightly as well. And we had to do a lot around community concerns. So, you know, if there had been racial unrest, then we'd have to consult a lot of different people, community leaders, before we did anything. So that was during Labour. We'd also, we'd have things like every month you'd have to do a 360-degree vision statement, and you'd ring up other departments within the police and ask them how your department was perceived by their department, and you know, whether your workers were arrogant or whether they were helpful, things like that. I mean, that would not happen now. No, there is no way that would be considered now. That would be considered a waste of money. And at the time, I must admit, some of us thought it was a waste of money as well, because we had murders to investigate, and we had to ring up our friends and say, how were we this month? Were we okay? Were we smart? Were we efficient? But, you know, it gives everybody a different attitude. It makes you think about how you can work together, and not just about performance targets, which is what it's based on now. I would say also under Labour, everything was about prevention. So if you could prevent something, even though it cost more money, it was worth doing, which is why they invested money in neighbourhoods, youth clubs, outreach, and that has completely gone. When the Tories came in, one of the first things they did was they told everybody they were going to double the neighbourhoods, and in each neighbourhood area, you'd get one officer that would go to community meetings. That was his job, community meetings, get the feedback, find out what the community is concerned about, you know, very, really important. So you'd have one officer to do that, and you'd have 6 to 12 officers to patrol the estates and get to know everyone, and to be on their feet and out and about, visible and approachable. When the Tories came in, they doubled the neighbourhoods. So they doubled the number of people that were going to go to the meetings, and they got rid of all the others. So there was nobody in the estates, nobody on the streets, just going to meetings and doing a PR job. So that was a typical change, you know. And for me, working on borough after the murder squads, I got promoted, went on to borough policing. So, you know, just local policing in detective work. And when we had a murder on borough or serious crime or rape, we used to go straight to the neighbourhoods and ask their advice as to, you know, who's got a beef with who, which gang's got a beef with which gang. And that disappeared. As soon as the Tories got in, it took about 6 months, and that disappeared. There was no one to talk to anymore. And then they merged boroughs, and police spent more time just going from one distant place to another, racing around the borough, answering 999 calls, no contact with the community. And, you know, the good police officers felt that, very, very strongly that they weren't doing a good job. It was completely impersonal. There's no contact, there's no relationship, and the bad ones are more isolated, so they feel more arrogant and they can get away with a lot more. So it's not a good position to be in now. And just before we merged boroughs, I was at Camden, and we merged with Islington, and there was a senior officer, assistant commissioner came, and he gave us all a lecture as to the use of technology is going to make it much more efficient. So we won't feel it. It's doubling the size, but we won't feel it because we'll use technology. We'll all have an iPad, well, a tablet, and we'll all be governed in a much better way, and we'll have much more time to go out into the community. Which is absolutely rubbish. And like for the first month, I remember there were 150 999 calls waiting to be answered on our borough, 150. And that's supposed to be an emergency that's answered within, an officer should be there within 5 minutes. And there were just 150 in the queue, just waiting. And they were making out it was going to be an improvement to efficiency. So, I mean, that was, we all told them it was a lie. And one thing that was really upsetting was that nobody seemed to push back. Maybe they did, but nobody seemed to push back to the government. We pushed back to the people above us, but nobody really seemed to push back beyond that. It was, and then one officer who's now chief superintendent in Harrogate, she's the borough commander now. I kind of mentored her as a detective. Really disappointed. She invented being omnicompetence. So as a detective, you can be omnicompetent. So instead of having Operation Sapphire to deal with rapes and be specialist, or Child Protection Unit to deal with sexual abuse of children, where people get courses in psychiatry and they get really properly trained up, and they get obviously assessed to see if they're suitable for that kind of work and they can handle the stress, especially if they've got young families. Suddenly they got rid of them because it saved money. So then every detective would deal with everything. And one of my mates, who was detective sergeant, and in one weekend, when they merged, they got rid of Sapphire, got rid of child protection, and he had to deal with 2 rapes of babies in one weekend, and he just had a baby himself. So he had to go home, deal with that during the weekend, and then go home with his wife and their new baby. And, he was in tears. He said, I haven't been trained to deal with this. And this was the kind of state, this was 10 years ago when Theresa May came in as Home Secretary. So, we've seen a lot of awful changes. So I'm not surprised the way the Tories are behaving now is being, it's quite predictable.
It looks like when you're working as a policeman, there is not a lot of decisions to be made at all. Because you just get these instructions and somebody imposed on you certain rules, and then the only thing you can do is, when you said we were pushing back to our bosses, so how would you describe that?
Pushing back is, when an officer, like for example, I used to work in intelligence as well, so you used to get my boss used to come in and he used to say, right, I want 10 warrants, search warrants issued. And, so I want 10 warrants done tomorrow morning. So put it together, please, Paul. So you'd look at the intelligence and you'd see what intelligence you had for criminals and, if they were having drugs delivered or whatever. And sometimes there wasn't enough for 10. So you go back and say, no, we've got enough for 4, but, this one, you've mentioned this one, he's flagged to the murder squads, this one's anti-terrorism, this one. And you can't just kick a door in, when if it's being watched by anti-terrorism, because you mess up their operation. So I'd go back and say, no, we can't do that because of this. And he'd say, no, we have to have 10. We have to have 10. I was like, well, I'm not doing it. Sorry. We have, because you only act on the intelligence. If you get enough intelligence and there is a problem, then you do something about it. But you don't turn it on its head and say, we have to show results. Therefore, and one of them I remember, which was famous actually, was a schoolboy who'd been seen smoking a spliff after school, and he was 11 years old, came out of school, smoking a spliff, stopped by the school's police officer, who told him off, took the spliff away and sent him on his way, put an intelligence report on. This DI wanted me to get a search warrant to kick his door in the morning, search the house. I mean, it's just absurd. And we just said no. So we actually took him to disciplinary in the end, this particular officer, because yeah, he was terrible. So yeah, we stopped his promotion for 7 years.
Can I ask a couple of questions?
Yeah.
Yeah, Paul. So were you given targets then, were you, by your superiors, and you had to achieve those targets?
Yes.
I mean, they sound, to me personally, as an outsider, rather crazy in a way. You were almost told, you know, arrest so many people, come up with so many warrants, and you had to sort of go out and find the criminals in order to come up with results for your superiors.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Do you think that there's an element there that the police were not necessarily wanting to, but they were in a position where they were forced to actually create crime?
Oh, no, exaggerate crime, I think. You know, you'd see, I mean, that's what happened with this schoolboy.
Yeah.
They turned him into a drug dealer because he was seen smoking a spliff after school.
Yeah,
So,
okay.
you know. And I mean, one particular officer that we also took action against was telling younger officers to lie to get the search warrant, you know, to embellish the evidence for the search warrant. And that's a sackable offence.
So in the case of that school kid who may 20, 30 years ago have been given a virtual slap over the wrists and gone round and visited his parents and made sure he didn't do it again, it was pushed in order to accelerate, exaggerate the nature of the situation. Is that a fair way of putting it, do you think?
Yeah. I mean, but at that point, we stopped it. Well, I stopped it. I'm not doing that. That's ridiculous, you know. And so we all had that attitude. We've just come out of a Labour government, so we were used to doing it the right way round. So, for example, in intelligence, we would have. I was a DS at the time, so detective sergeant. So you'd have a team, and you'd have one desk for burglary. You'd have one desk for robbery. You'd have one desk for knife crime. And so the intel would come in to that desk, and you decide your job was to try and lower the figures, you know, like to tackle the crime, to actually change the number of people that were being victimized. So that was your job. And how you did it was really up to you and anybody, so this is a good decision-making point, getting back to the decision-making. So anybody could come up with a plan to, as in an operating plan, a policing plan. Anybody of any rank, doesn't matter, you put in a plan. So they had a form for this, and they'd have to make sure that it fitted in with MOPAC, which is...
What's MOPAC?
MOPAC is the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime.
And was this Ken Livingstone's era?
I think it was, yeah.
Okay.
So so they would say, and there used to be a basket of crimes, and they used to say, these are the priorities, go out and reduce these crimes. So burglary is usually there, vehicle crime was in there for some reason for a while. Violent crime has always been in there. So, I mean, at the moment, it is keeping children safe. They're much more vague now because it's easier not to fail. Keeping children safe, tackling violence to women and girls, and standing together against hatred, intolerance, and extremism. Which could be XR, of course.
Yes.
So, yeah, so you'd have, if you had a plan, you thought you could reduce the number of burglaries, for example, then you could put a plan together. You'd have to make sure, you'd have to justify in your form how it fitted with the strategy, similar to XR actions. So it'd have to fit the strategy, and you'd have to make sure it's proportionate, legal, accountable, and necessary. Okay, so they're the four things that tackle human rights. And it was in the public interest. You'd have to show that it was in the public interest to do it. So if it was used a lot of surveillance, was very intrusive, it would have to be a very high level of danger to the public to justify that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's quite a good way. So the officer of any rank would put this plan together, put down their justification. It would then come to me. I would check it all to make sure it was in line with the strategy and that we could afford it, for example. There would also be a money bit in there. And that the community that it was going to be acted upon had been consulted, and what the issues were there was there high tensions, for example. And then if I liked it, then I would sign it and it would go to my boss, who would then say, yep, like it, let's do it. So he would have the overall command. So you've got a very strict hierarchy, but that was on a local basis. And then that would be fractalized. Can you say that? And so that would be reproduced on a bigger basis for anti-terrorism. It would be on a much bigger basis for the whole region, for the whole Met. Everything follows the same thing, really. So somebody would put an operation together, somebody would check it's in line with the strategy, then it gets signed off. Depending how much money is involved, it gets signed off by the top person.
Hi, Paul, I have a question.
Yeah.
You mentioned the mayor's office. I'm just curious about the role that the local political leaders play in the police officials and the way investigations work, evidence and sort of pinning it down on someone, or sort of favorisms. And I mean, there's a very deep connection between politics and police in India. And I'm tuning in from New Delhi. So I'm curious about how those connections play out in your field.
Well, we've got police and crime commissioners who are elected by the public for a particular area. So the one for London is Sadiq Khan, who's the mayor of London. He's also the police and crime commissioner. So his job is to come up with he came up with the keeping children safe, violence against women and girls, and standing together against hatred, intolerance, and extremism. So he came up with those three things. So he's saying he's going to give money to support operations that tackle those three strands. So that's his job. How do we spend taxpayers' money? They tax, obviously, they tax people within the community, and that they have to decide how that money gets paid or how that money gets used.
I remember, Paul, when we were talking about when power interferes with decision making, and you gave the example of the recent Extinction Rebellion protest at News Corp. Do you want to tell us about that, how it happened?
Yeah, that was quite interesting, because there were only, I think there were 90 activists there, some locked on the ground, some on these amazing bamboo towers. And when
just to say, sorry, just to add for those who don't know, the News Corp is, these were the printing houses of Murdoch's newspapers.
Yeah. Rupert Murdoch, they're in Broxbourne in northeast London. And so basically they just moved in there, set up with a couple of vans, lock-ons and bamboo structures with two people suspended at the top. So you couldn't move the structure without them falling. So quite a problem for the police to remove. And the first thing that happened was the police, I made contact with the local police. They were not from the Metropolitan, so they were from Hertfordshire, and much nicer to deal with. And they said, first thing they said is, we understand you have a right to protest and we respect that, but could you please do it not in the road over there on the grass, go over the, could you move everything and go over there because you're blocking the print works? And we said, well, I'll ask, but I think that's the idea, so I don't think they'll move. And he went, okay, I thought you'd say that. So then we had quite a good rapport. And then he got in touch with the Printworks, and then he came back and he said, right, apparently this Printworks, it's all electronic, so they just send it to another Printworks, and so it won't have any effect on the news going out in the morning. So you're really wasting your time. That was the first lie that came from the police. And I said, I don't think that's true, but we're going to stay here anyway, you know. So we did. And then we were told there were 500 workers that wouldn't be able to get home when they finished their shift at 1 o'clock in the morning. And we were blocking 500 workers. We saw about 20 workers because it's an automated plant and it had all been researched. We knew how many people were in there. So, and we basically told them, I think Rupert Murdoch can afford to pay their taxi home in this situation. So that message went out, and I think they did get taxis home. So, and then we were there until 6 o'clock in the morning, and we'd said 10 o'clock, we're going to unlock and we'll go, you know, or you can arrest us. But at 10 o'clock, we are finished. That's the end. We've stopped the press. That's the end. And the police said, okay, well, that's not good enough. We want you off in an hour. And this was 10 o'clock at night. And we said we'd be gone at 10 o'clock in the morning, 12 hours. And they said, no, we want you gone in 1 hour. So if that's not the case, we're going to call the Met. They come in and they're going to take you down. And we said, that's going to take them a long time and it puts people at risk. So could you not wait till 10 o'clock and we'll just do it, we'll just unlock ourselves and go. And they said, no, we're calling the Met. So they called the Met and they were there until about midday. So it took them 2 hours longer to deconstruct. If they just agreed with us, then we would have come off earlier than leaving it to the Met. 6 o'clock in the morning, the senior officer there said that he confided to me that his chief constable had been on the phone to him to say that Priti Patel had been on the phone to him in the morning at 6 o'clock in the morning. So Rupert Murdoch in Australia had been on the phone to Priti Patel to do something with the police in England at 6 o'clock in the morning. That is the power that Rupert Murdoch has, so, telling governments what to do. It's just obscene. So
Did
it become a public knowledge, this information about Rupert Murdoch calling
I don't think it did become public knowledge, no. But I mean, there's photographs of Rupert Murdoch's wedding, so everybody knows they were quite close.
Yeah.
There were many articles after that with Priti Patel saying that what the Extinction Rebellion does is trying to stop democracy because people are not reading news, things like that. So
yeah.
Indirectly, she showed her position.
Yeah, but it's often happened with under austerity. We'd have a situation. It's usually when you're about to go home, you get a call about a threat to life or a child in danger, and you'd start working on it. And say maybe a high risk missing. So a 9-year-old's gone missing from a problem family, and he's been reported missing by the school. Hasn't been at school all day. So the family might have murdered that child. You don't know. Something bad might have happened to that child. So you have to try and find that child. So you go and see your boss and say, look, we'll have to stay on and work on this. We've done this. And then they'd say, no, because of the money, you have to go home and we'll brief up another team to take over overnight. And you lose information. It's not the best way to deal with it at all. But because they couldn't pay us for a couple of hours to stay on and brief the next team, it was more important to save a little bit of money, even though it's the death of a child potentially, than whereas that would never have happened under the Labour government. That just wouldn't happen. People's lives were more important than the overtime bill.
Okay, but so can I ask a question about decision making? Imagine you are the one who is designing the structure in an ideal way, so you have all the resources possible. It's understandable that the police, in this case, as any military units, should be structured in a hierarchical way, probably.
Yeah.
I don't think it's possible to structure it not hierarchically. Maybe it is. So what would be your approach to the ideal structure of the ideal police in the absence of any austerity or any obstacles at all?
That's a good question.
I think it would be good if there are some there needs to be, I mean, the actual decision-making process and the hierarchy is pretty good, I would say. The thing is, when it goes wrong and you get a bad person in a position of power, then there's nobody that's really looking for that. They can't afford, there has to be another organization that's, checking to make sure everything's working properly. And there isn't really, they can't afford that. So, and the people that are getting into power, when austerity came in and the Tories came in, a lot of good people left the hierarchy, and a lot of very ambitious people climbed the hierarchy to take their place, and they're more interested in their own careers than they are in doing a good job. So, and there's really nothing in place to deal with that.
So last conversation we had in this series was with one of the members of Museum of Care who was working in Colombia and described the system, justice system there. And so they have these two kind of parallel system. One is governmentally run, one is run by the community, by the Native Americans that existed there forever. And so they have a certition they rotate the families that is in charge of the local courts, as well as investigative work. And they collect money in the community to do that, because very often they don't need outside structures to interfere with what's going on. So in a way, if I understood correctly what you described before, when you were working under labor, it was a little bit like that. The government paid to the police to go and collaborate with the local structures that already was in place, who knew, who is troublemaker, who is doing what. And that was already kind of these two branches that was kind of coordinatingly working. And in this case, maybe you have an hierarchy in the police who is an executive power, like who's actually going and stopping the crime or doing things like that. And then you have the community centers or community leaders who is overlooking what the people with guns are doing. And so they are like the controllers in a way. Yeah, not somebody from up, not the mayor of London, who's like a big city, he possibly cannot know what's going on everywhere, but the local communities. Would you think this structure would work?
Yeah, I mean, it did work. And the thing is, it's expensive. So under a Tory government, if you've got neighborhood police and it looks like they're not doing anything, if crime goes down, the Tory view is that, well, we'll take them out because there's nothing to do. But it's preventative. The whole point is that there's relationships and it's part of the community. And if there's no measurable target, then the Tory view is that, there's no point in being there. So they take them out, and they don't really care if crime goes up in the estates because they don't go to the estates. They're all from a very different background. So whereas under the Labour view, it was something that could be maintained because it's preventative, and that was so much better. And as it went on, the relationships got better, and children had known the same police officer for maybe 10 years through the whole of their schooling. That has a big effect on how they behave, and it has a very different mindset to racing on blue lights to get there, jumping out of a car, sticking handcuffs on someone and chucking them in the van.
And Paul, in that same sort of area, what about liaison with schools between police officers and so on and so forth? Have you got any views on what you think is good practice in that area?
Yeah, I mean, we had schools officers as well. So there'll be, schools officers, at least 2 per school, and they would get to know the kids. I mean, that's a really good thing. And I think they've kept those, I think. Some head teachers don't like them because they've often the left-wing head teachers push them out because they think they're spying on the kids and they don't want that. But most of them see it's a good thing. And if you've got gangs in the area, it's a very good thing because it stops the gangs getting into the schools and getting the kids dealing, from the school gates. So it stops that.
I was thinking that what you said earlier about crime, prevention versus targets, it sounds like under Labour there was this kind of a consensus amongst police officers of what good practice is, and that there is still a kind of memory of that. So you were able, because you knew how it was before, to step in and say, no, I'm not going to do that. Were there a lot of do you think there was a lot of room between police officers to kind of organize inside and to kind of challenge these definitions of what is or values it's themselves?
Yeah. I had my own network of lefty police officers. Yeah, definitely. And we used to have places we could, go and have a moan and decide how we were going to influence what was going on inside. And you always have to use harm to society. So you're in a meeting and the big boss is saying, right, we're going to do this, this, and this. Then you'd have to just turn around and say, if you do that, then these people are going to get killed, or this child is likely to be raped if you do that. And you have to be really blunt. They didn't like it at all. But but I was in a situation where I wasn't going to be promoted anymore. I decided I didn't want to get promoted. Whereas if you were going to get promoted, or you wanted to be promoted, then obviously being that vocal didn't help your chances. So yeah, but there were a lot of us that decided, because once you get above detective sergeant, so you're like a team leader, once you get above that, you don't go out. You're doing budgeting and logistics. So that's a really boring job for a lot of us. So it's much better to go out. Whereas in the old days,
it sounded also that going out was almost part of creating those values, because you said you spent time with people asking them how did they perceive police, right? So in a way, what Nika was saying, that there was this local parallel system where you are constantly checking with the community what they need.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And in the old days, even under Margaret Thatcher, because I'm that old, the like detective inspectors, that was one above me, they used to deal with their own investigations. Detective chief inspectors had their own investigations. So they used to take rapes and serious assaults and murders. So they would be doing the actual job on the ground in the community, whereas that's completely gone now, which is a real shame. Probably more efficient, but it's a real shame.
So Paul, just to be clear, are you saying that it's the grassroots police personnel who are actually doing all the work, and everyone seniority wise is sort of tied up into this bureaucratic paperwork and administration, and they don't really have any connection with the people, if at all? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
It's so crazy.
Yeah, and if you look at the grassroots, people are so inexperienced now. They're I've been told, I've chatting to one person who's detective sergeant, so he's a team leader, same as I was. So he said, now the youngsters, there's so many new ones from Priti Patel, we're going to get 20,000 new officers. And they're completely inexperienced. A lot of them are on the fringes of criminality themselves. So, and they're going up to get advice from a sergeant, and they put their body-worn video on to record the advice, so that if they make a mistake, then they can get someone as well. He told me, look, it's on my video. So that's how the relationship is that good in the police now. So yeah, it's not a good job to be in.
Wow, it's like really like a corporation, like a private corporation with like no responsibility, and in a way private army, because if they don't have a connection to the community, then they don't have emotional ties, they can do harm and don't care.
No, and the bad supervisors, for example, I was in CID, so it was always investigation, but in my view, the bad supervisors, that you get a crime come in and you'd have to allocate it to an investigator, a detective, and they would cut and paste a list of inquiries like CCTV, so, and there may be like 20 things for the officer to do, but it wasn't always relevant. So they would just, in order to make their life easy, they would cut and paste the same list on every crime. So you imagine the victim doesn't get treated very well because the officer just sees this massive list and he's like, oh, have you done this? Well, that's not relevant. Have you done this? That's not relevant. It's not personalized to the individual at all. It's just a cut and paste. So I hated that. I didn't do that. And when you look at what's happened to a victim of crime, it's obvious that there are certain things that are a priority,
Mm-hmm.
And if you just cut and paste, then you miss that. So that's very bad practice in my view.
But is it exist some kind of still community prevention practices in London? Because as we were told by Matt, who was working in Colombia for a couple of years, this local structures of the Native Americans, despite the occupation and all bad things that happened to them, they somehow were able to save them, so they still exist. Is anything like that exist in the UK?
Give us an example of what
Neighbourhood watch, I suppose, maybe something like that.
Sorry, say again.
Neighbourhood watch, maybe something like that. I think Nika's talking about sort of a community spirit which helps deal with crime non-police type ways. Nika, is that what you're
Yeah,
asking?
maybe not even spirit, but some kind of structures. Because before you were saying that Tories shut up all the youth centers and many of these structures that was paid by the government. But if something paid by the government can shut it up. So the Native Americans didn't get money from the government. They have their own system of support, including financial support of their structures of justice and crime prevention. And that's why this existed for hundreds of years. So my question is, anything like that exists in the UK outside of the government's budget?
Only thing I can think of is in the Hasidic Jewish community in Stamford Hill. So they've got their own police who are just citizens, they're just volunteers, but they work with the police as well. And they normally turn up at crimes and help liaise, because obviously they have very strict rules, especially with the women in the Hasidic community. So they work quite well. I think it works quite well, actually. There's been some horrible stories in Stamford Hill. There was a crossroads, and on the Sabbath, they wouldn't push the button to cross the road to make the lights change, and they would cross the road in the traffic, and it was like every weekend somebody would get hit by a car because they wouldn't push the button. So I know it's not funny, but it's just they just used to run out and then get hit. And so the police came to an agreement that they would put a wire around the crossing, which took it outside the Sabbath rules, and then they could push the button. They were allowed to push the button. Sounds a bit crazy if you're not in that world, but that was good work. There is some good work, but that was under Labour as well. I'm not sure if that would happen under the Tory government.
Can I ask a question? I'm going to change direction, and I'm sorry if if you want to follow what some of the other questions are going with, come back to them. But you did mention a moment ago, I find this difficult to believe, Paul. You say you remember the Thatcher era. You don't look like you do.
That's nice of you. That's nice.
Paul, are you aware of the scandal around Psychops?
Yeah.
Yeah. How, for those of you who aren't perhaps so familiar with it, back in the late 70s, I think it was, maybe into the 80s, some undercover police officers became very intimate with some activists. Helen Steele was one of them. She was involved in a campaign against McDonald's. And my question for you, because it's about decision making, how within the police force is a decision made for undercover officers to be able to do something like that? Could it still happen today? Could it be used as a tactic against Extinction Rebellion, for example? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah. So in 2000, the RIPA came about, which was regulation on undercover policing, and that kind of stopped it. So under RIPA, I just went into that world, undercover world, which was dealing with informants actually at the time. So you have to protect their identity, and they also are obviously involved in crime, and then they come back and talk to you about it and get paid. So it needed rigorous discipline to administer that. And under RIPA, everything has to be proportionate, legal, accountable, and necessary. So you have to justify it each time. And depending on the amount of intrusion, it depends on the level, the rank of the officer that has to authorize it. So for an undercover officer, it would be a commando. So that's higher than a borough boss. That's way beyond. And there'd be specialists. That's all they did, was to look at RIPA applications and authorize them or not authorize them. And it's quite difficult to get authority for an undercover to go in. Same for participating informants is the same thing, because that's basically an undercover who's not a police officer. So all informants, when I was doing it, that's after 2000, were not allowed to participate in crime, were not allowed to commit any crime unless they had specific authority from a senior officer. And then they would be told exactly what they could do and the circumstances. Like, on this day, you can handle a gun. We're doing an operation. So on this day, when you can go into this shop and buy a gun from this person, for example.
Right.
And the problem with so the officer who authorized that at a high level, he would have to justify, making sure it was proportionate, necessary, as in there was no other way to tackle this gun problem without doing it this way. So that necessity is a really big thing. So if you could do it by just kicking the door in and doing a raid, you should do it that way. But if you needed to track down the one above, then you'd have to do it with the UC. So necessity was a really big thing. The senior officer would authorize it. Now, at that time, if something went wrong, the senior officer is liable and the undercover officer is liable to be charged with handling the firearm. So that's why this spy cops bill has come in to try and give them some protection so that somebody is happy to be an undercover cop and doesn't feel liable every time they go to work. That if something goes wrong, they've got no cover whatsoever and they're going to end up in court. So so that's why this has come in. So I'm not totally against the spy cops bill, but for me, I think it should be a judge that makes that decision and not a senior officer.
Well, I was going to say, where does the buck stop? Eventually, it goes outside the police force and it goes to judiciary. It's not, and there's not political involvement, in your opinion, from Home Secretary, for example, or somebody within the Home Office.
Well, I think no. I think the police are quite rigorous. I left 2 years ago. I retired 2 years ago. The police were quite rigorous and professional, I thought, at that time. Obviously, not in the 70s and 80s. Because there was no administration in those days. If the boss said, yeah, do it, that was it. The undercover could go and do it. And his job was to fit in. And if that meant having relationships and babies, there was no real paperwork. He was just doing his job. Awful, terrible, terrible situation. But now that, it is quite rigorous. So is there political? I think the political pressure is to make XR fit in to one of the categories to make it a higher priority. So when every time they call us, we're extremists, eco-terrorists, organised crime group, what else? Progressive extremism is the newest one with Lord Walney, who's just been given the job of investigating XR.
Okay.
So, and he's talking about progressive extremism. Right. And as you heard, extremism is one of the 3 things that the mayor wants investigated and wants to put money into. So if they get us into that bracket, then I can imagine they will be using covert means, but probably covert online, I think, more than undercovers.
The other thing which used to happen back in the 70s and the 80s, and again, I think you hinted at it a little bit when you were talking about the actions which you were taking against Murdoch, was a sort of a divide and rule type of approach. So you would bring in police officers from one part of the country into another part of the country where they weren't a part of the community, they didn't have any involvement in the community, and they would deal with that situation. You probably realize, I'm thinking of the miners' strike in particular, where officers from one part of the country would be sent off to Yorkshire. You had Orgreave and all the rest of it and the other. Is that part of police practice much today? You did hint that that's the sort of way in which it was dealt with at News International. It's against the idea of community-based policing, isn't it, really?
Yeah, public order is something which I hated. Public order. I had to go the first few football matches I went to, and you just faced drunken louts calling you, just screaming every obscenity in your face from somebody you didn't know. I just didn't like it. I didn't like football anyway, so I didn't even enjoy the match. So I got out of that. That's why I went into detective work. And now I'm doing public order all the time. So public order is much more military based, much more hierarchical. And because I always have a chat with a senior officer when I'm at an action and say, what about integrity? And when I joined, I signed an oath. The first line of the oath was protect life. Your fundamental duty and the first principle is to protect life. And that's gone. That's not in the oath anymore. It's uphold law and order.
Interesting.
Which is much more manipulatable for government because they make the laws, whereas protect life, that would be come and join XR because we're out there to protect life. That's how I justify the fact that I'm, it's the same as being in the police for me, because we're here to protect life and the future of our kids. So So I have these conversations with senior officers, and a lot of them have just said, come on, you know what public order's like, you do as you're told, you know, there's no debate. It's like go and kettle those people over there, go and stop them, go and arrest them. And it's that's it. It's much more, there's no room for arguments.
And do you still have divisions within the police force like the SPG, which we used to have back in the late 70s, the Special Patrol Group?
Well, it's the TSG is the equivalent of the SPG, but it's not quite the same.
Okay, I'm interested. In what ways is it different then?
The SPG were more a law unto themselves.
Yeah.
And there was they specialised in fitting people up.
Yes, that's
I think.
rumours.
Yeah, I mean, I joined at the time of the SPG. I joined in 1983. So and so I was there for the Tottenham riots, for example, and the SPG were just being phased out, but a few came from the SPG back to borough to do normal policing. And the stories, you know, it was basically if they didn't like you and they thought you were a criminal, the good ones, they thought you were a criminal, but they didn't have the evidence. They used to supply the evidence, you know, because they felt it was justified because they knew you were a criminal.
Yeah.
But of course, that is so, you know, that's completely wrong. And then you just get arrogant little units with peer pressure that just feel they can do whatever they want to do and arrest whoever they want to do and convict whoever they want because they'll just manufacture the evidence. I mean, that was awful.
So some of those situations which we had back in the late 70s and going into the early 80s, and there was, I think you're painting a little bit of a picture with regarding decision making within the police force, that there were units within the police force which were almost out of control in a way, and they were perhaps doing their own thing. But you think that things have improved since then, and that there's a little bit more formality in the way the police actually take their decisions and operate these days?
I'll say after Stephen Lawrence, when Stephen Lawrence investigation occurred, and the McPherson report, I mean, there were two black guys on my team, and they were incensed when it was told, we were all told we have to be very careful with banter and how we kind of tease each other and the language we use, and because we could be personally sued and we might be thrown out of the job for using any kind of thing with a racial inference. And the guys that I worked with, because we worked in quite a close team, they were really angry and say, look, you know, if you say anything I don't like, I'm going to punch you in the face, mate. And that was their attitude, and because we had a quite equal relationship, which it should be. So a lot of us were like, we don't need this. We respect each other anyway. And if we do have banter, they're rude to me, I'm rude to them. And, you know, it's kind of a personal level playing field. But after about 3 years, and you could see the culture changing in the canteen, in the station, and it was transformed. And most of us, even old ones, had to admit it was so much better because people were scared to say the wrong thing. They had to think about what they were saying and the consequences of what they were saying. And it improved greatly. And before I left, the situation was such that if somebody said something inappropriate in a police car, for example, and there were 3 people, one person said something inappropriate, one person reported it for investigation because he said something inappropriate. The third one, who didn't report it and didn't say anything, would be investigated as well as the other one and probably disciplined or kicked out of the job for not saying anything. So it's really strong now. It's really strong. Sorry, it was really strong when I left. Don't know what's happened now.
Okay.
And is there a law based on what inappropriate is, as in like racial slurs or certain slurs about sexual minorities? So is this like defined in law what inappropriate would mean, and is there a consensus on that?
Anything racially offensive that could be deemed as offensive, it's a really low bar because it's based on people's perception. But then it goes to a board of to judge, you know, whether what you said was offensive or not, and you can lose your job. You'd normally get a formal warning first, but then you can lose your job.
Go back.
That's a really good thing.
I was just thinking of Nika's question about informal structures that are taking place. I was reading an article saying that partially why the government also wanted to open it all up in the summer, the lockdown, was because they were afraid that all these mutual aid groups were becoming more and more formalized and stronger, and they might actually ask for collective change. I wonder whether police had were there any changes during the pandemic that you're aware of, or any kind of push for, you know, we talked on the phone about what's happening in the States and how they are trying to find alternative ways of organizing the police. Is there anything like that happening in the UK?
No, I'm in my local mutual aid group in Brent, and at the beginning, obviously, it was perceived that there was going to be an increase in domestic violence and child abuse. So I reached out to local police and managed to get a direct contact, so that they didn't have to ring 101 or 999. You know, they had somebody they could just phone up and get direct contact with the police to respond. So that's interesting that the police are perceiving the local groups to be a threat. Are they seeing it as a threat?
No, I think it was, you know, just how government, they wanted to open it all up because they made these structures a bit redundant. If we are able to help ourselves, then why do we need the police, right? Or so these are scary questions in people's minds if you leave these structures for too long to exist.
Yeah. No, I think generally the police are pretty accountable, and it's like chatting with Roger Hallam at the beginning, and he used to say to me, you know, we just want the police to turn, you know, take out their warrant cards, put their truncheons on the ground, take off their uniform, and just come over to XR and have a hug and join us, and you know, and realise what they're doing is wrong. And I said they're not going to do that, because 99% of the time they're racing around to 999 calls, you know, to a burglary or robbery or somebody who's been assaulted, and they feel quite good about what they're doing 99% of the time. And a lot of them, when they were dealing with XR, they really enjoyed dealing with XR in protests, especially in April, and not so much in October, but especially in April. So yeah, they don't feel bad. If they were being asked to CS spray protesters or beat the crap out of them, or, you know, or water cannon, then they probably would feel bad, but they're not being asked to do that yet. But it is getting a little bit more acute, I would say.
Yeah, coming back to what Anka said, I do believe that government in general, as power structures, they don't want alternative power structures to exist. And if their, let's say, community organize itself strongly, and not on the basis of specific religious or national groups, like, for example, Hasidic Jews, because Hasidic Jews cannot multiply throughout all UK. It's a certain amount of them living here, yeah. But if some other network of solidarity would suddenly start to unfold, and they will really be global, yeah, then that will represent a threat for the power. And in this case, I believe Tories is not only dismantle working system because they're really saving money, because I think it's the same money you can spend on, you know, big salaries of the boss, or on like filling out the paperwork, as we know it's very costly to have all these people, you know, producing paperwork and checking on each other. It's also cost money, but it's a different way of spending money. And it's make, you know, these poor communities, you said that they're mostly crime in the specific areas, and that's where the preventive work should be done if you want to reduce crime, but maybe reduction of the crime is not actually the aim, because you can control population very differently, not necessarily by you know, stop protecting babies or whatever. So my question is, it looks like what you're describing is the two different political visions of how England can be organized. Am I right?
Yeah. I mean, look at in Camden, you've got the biggest cannabis market, really, in Camden Market. So we had Somali gangs and we had Sudanese gangs predominantly, and they identified that way as well, dealing drugs, and they fight and they stab each other, sometimes shoot each other. But in Camden, they decided that there was no drugs problem because nobody comes forward to report they have a problem with drugs. So there's no victim. So therefore, there is no problem. But it was a huge driver for violence. And, you know, we've been asking to legalize drugs for a long, long time. And there's more of a Tory push not to. And there's a lot of people that say that if you did legalize drugs, then there's so much money tied up in banking and you know, on the supposedly legitimate side, that they don't want to lose that income, you know, which is probably true. But that, I mean, that would be amazing to see all drugs get legalized and put the money into health and to start developing society and see what difference that would make. But they're too scared to do it. I mean, it's just, I would say at least 50% of police want that.
Wow.
I would say.
Yeah. Well, Paul, what you mentioned, I mean, I feel like one of my professors told me that, you know, a police officer is also a person with the moral values, and like they go home and they discuss it with their own families, you know, what's going on, the news and all. And so I'm curious about how you negotiate those two personas of embodying a police structure and also being a personal person with your own values, and what role resistance plays in the police precinct, as in, like, say if you and a couple of your colleagues decide that, oh, this is not the right thing, say the public order that you mentioned, oh, this is really not working out, what kind of a role does that resistance play? And do you have a say? Do you collectively have a say with your seniors? And I mean, overall, you know, I mean, like you said, your own politics says that, oh, money should go into healthcare workers and we don't really need this many personals and all. So how do you negotiate those values while embodying those two roles, if I'm asking this correctly?
Personally, I made sure I applied for jobs that were more in line with my personal values. A bit of an easy way out, because I think it is, when you deal with really serious crime, the ethics are easy, you know.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's easy. That's a good thing to catch the murderer, but before he kills someone else. If you're dealing with a neighborhood dispute, then it's much more difficult because the right and wrongs are not so clear. So I've made sure that I went for, yeah, the serious stuff. And my last job was kind of both, actually. It was sort of managing sex offenders. So they'd do their term in prison and then they would come out, and it would be managing them to make sure they don't reoffend. So it was kind of social work. We'd try and get them jobs. We'd deal with who they should disclose their past to. So if they're in a relationship, we'd make sure they would have to disclose it themselves. And we'd manage these people to try and make sure they didn't offend. So when the Tories came in and they merged the boroughs, I had a team of 5 specially trained people, and then they merged the boroughs, and I had 320 sex offenders to manage, and murderers as well. And then they merged the boroughs, and then I had 670. And they changed my staff, so they weren't trained anymore. So it's just like, what are you doing? So every day I'll just write an email to the boss saying, you're putting people at risk. Their kids are going to get snatched off the street. They're going to get raped. This is what's happening. We cannot deal with this number of people. And he would write back and say, yeah, don't worry. We've all got to suffer. And I said, I'm not worrying. I've told you about it. I've told you the risk is with you. So deal with it, you know? So, and that would be a daily thing. I would send these emails every day to the boss, saying that what's happening is not good. It's putting children at risk. And that's the only thing you can do, really. So, yeah, I think it's, yeah. But generally, most police officers feel that they're doing quite a good job. And I was just part of we just had a Zoom with the Dalai Lama. And it was like police and the Dalai Lama. It was overnight as well. It was like, yeah, I know, weird, isn't it? And and there were like 1,500 police officers, a lot of duty from the police station that zoomed in to speak to the Dalai Lama.
Wow.
Yeah. But, you know, and a lot of them are saying, I can't deal with the pressure because I deal with horrible stuff. I see dead bodies, horrible violence. and how do you deal with, and they were asking the Dalai Lama how to deal with the stress. They weren't asking about what was wrong with society, really. You know,
Yeah.
It was a sticking plaster, and that's a shame. So I'm trying to reach out to the ones that registered to see the Dalai Lama, to see if we can influence them a little bit for XR.
Sounds like an opportunity to, I wonder how many police officers are actually in XR, as in part of.
Well, not many. But we've been told that there's nothing to stop police officers joining XR. It's not illegal. I've got one from a detention centre in northeast London. She's contacted me and really wants to join. She lives in Essex, but you know, so we said join your local group. She doesn't want to get. She's been told don't get arrested by the police. Don't get arrested, but you can join XR. So, which is nice. But imagine if she's in a local group and the local group are doing an action which is a little bit spicy, and they know that she's in the group. That's going to make them all a little bit nervous, I think.
But this is also where it could be, where change could happen, where the boundaries between us and them are not so big. And I think you mentioned as an alternative, you know, when we talked about what's happening in Colombia, where the group of people are part, you know, there is this consensus around shame, and then the person who committed the crime is shamed publicly, and then the community comes together as a in the process of restoration. And you talked to me, you told me that this actually in a way already happened when police was more linked to the community, that there was more time and resources to think what happened after, you know, with the consent of the victim, for them to be involved, not only with jail and punishing, but also part of the, no, this was Colombia actually. Matt was telling us about Colombia. Yeah, so you mentioned that these things were already happening, where community was somehow part of the response of the
no, restorative
linked with police.
Restorative justice is something that's run as a kind of scheme in certain areas, but it's not properly funded, you know, and it is the best, absolutely best solution to crime. You know, it stops people committing crime forever. You know, it completely changes people inside, and or it can, you know, it has that potential, and so it's worth the money. And I'm really upset that it's not being done more and more. It's love, really, isn't it? It's about love.
Care.
And freedom. Yeah. So freedom, because yeah, care without freedom is prison. But if you only provide freedom and not provide care, that will be neoliberalism. You know, that will be just go do whatever, and that also would not be perfect.
Can I ask you a question? Do you think that XR should have some kind of hierarchy?
We are not. I suppose when we spoke to Claire about decision making in XR, and so she showed us the structures. Sounds like there is a structure, not so much vertical, but there's something there, you know, a kind of horizontal, oblique, like many directions, and it seems to work. I don't know. I'm not really very involved.
Yeah.
What do you think? Do you think they should have?
I think we need a sortition. We need some kind of assembly at the top. And I think if XR fail to, and we were supposed to have an action council, so any bad actions that come forward goes to the action council to decide, and that should be a proper sortition-based group. But then they found out it was too difficult to do, so they didn't do it. And I think that is terrible, seeing that it's one of our 3 demands to have citizens' assemblies. Not to actually do it ourselves is poor. So we're pushing to get that up and running.
I think it's quite interesting, Paul, when we did have the discussion with Claire from Extinction Rebellion about how they make decisions and so on and so forth. I think some of the things that were coming across is that she was quite in favour of what I would call affinity groups. So fairly small groups of people who are focused around a particular task and getting it done. And one thing which she said, which I found very interesting myself, is she said that initially they had started off trying to organise on an almost national basis. So you'd have an English section and a French section and a Spanish section and so on. And she said that broke down and it didn't work very well, and it worked out to be better to deal with it by language. So you'd have a Spanish section and a French section based on language rather than nationality. And she said that that also, I think she was saying that that had benefits because the whole issue of climate change is an international one rather than a national one. And that was the picture which I got. And she spoke about, so what was that thing, the frog glass or something? And she showed us that and how they make their decisions. Anka or Nika, do you remember what that was about? Anyway, but it was portrayed as being very horizontal. I always have a vision in my head, a bit like a sort of a spider's web. And there's sort of threads going on here and there, and they all join up and they all link up, but they're all a little bit separate at the same time. And I think that that often does work quite well, particularly with social movements like that.
I think also providing a security and in a way resistance to the system, because if you're not vertical, it's very difficult to kind of dismantle you and cancel you, you know, because you're so many. Basically you're nothing, you're only the name and the idea. So you can, you only can dismantle so many affinity groups, but then the others will keep existing and they also keep be popping up. And also in other interesting things, what Claire was saying is you have to have a consensus process if you do the action, because it could be dangerous, you could be arrested. So you cannot push people to do things that is dangerous for them without a full consensus. So that's it's kind of naturally produce this grassroots democracy. But another thing is if that's what you were saying, Paul, about police, is in a way, if you're in a confrontation and the police is in confrontation or in control of crimes, and XR in this case also is an open confrontation with the system, because the major things XR is saying we have to change the way how society is working. So this is declaration of the war in a way. And so in the moment you are in war, you have to have some sort of hierarchy. Otherwise, nothing could be done, you know, because you spend so much time kind of trying to agree with everybody internally that you would not be able to act. And so my understanding with XR is that is an internal conflict that would not be able to be resolved ever. But it's in a way it's a laboratory for the new forms of you know, organizational forms that will be born, and we're all going to use them. And so in our, for example, Museum of Care, we also have a kind of laboratory for how to relate to each other and how to produce things, because whenever you want to do something like a website or anything simple, or exhibition or project, you have to have a hierarchy. Otherwise it's not working, because or you have to have a very small structure, like Hasidic Jews, you know, who is able to negotiate with each other because they're so much similar, you know, they have like these rules that they all follow, sign up for this cult or religion or whatever. So that's my understanding.
You just reminded me actually that one thing I haven't said is the kind of tension in the police between operations. So there'd be the day-to-day policing and answer 999 calls and investigations. And so I would be like, often if there'd been a murder, I'd go to the murder, and the senior officer would be the local borough commander, might come down and he'd say, right, I want this wrapped up by 5 o'clock. We've got too many people. It costs too much money, blah, blah, blah. And I would be much junior to him, but I would have expertise. So there would be a tension between expertise and the rank. you know, his position. And so then I would normally say, okay, I understand that. I'm just making a note of that. So you want it wrapped up. So just to let you know, sorry, what's your name? Yeah, okay. Right, just to let you know, I'm going to write a report for the coroner, and I'm, you know, obviously I'll have to tell him that because of what you told me, I have to wrap it up. So we might lose evidence there. We might lose evidence there. Just, are you sure you want me to do that? And then 9 times out of 10, they was like, okay, what time should we finish then? And I said, well, we finish when we finish the scene, or when we finish it. And they were like, all right then. So there was always this tension between, and it goes way up, you know, like in anti-terrorism, in murders, it goes way up. So there's the specialists and there's the actual senior officers. And if they're any good and they're experienced, they would always ask the specialists, you know, because that's why they're there. So, and work together. But some are assholes and they don't.
Paul, speaking of tensions about the expertise, do you think XR is suffering from that? Like some of the activists are scientists, so they have sort of embodying the expertise of the climate change and the numbers and the statistics. And then there are other activists who are sort of organically involved into XR, so they're not really experts in it. So do you think that distinction is being made in XR's movement, that tension that you're speaking of?
Yeah, absolutely. And what's nice is that we've just started on Action Circle. So I run Police Liaison. And what's nice is that we're all the support groups like stewards, Police Liaison, Wellbeing, Embodying Non-Violence, all of these support groups for actions are now sitting in one circle. So when whoever around the country wants to do an action, they can come to us and we give advice. So it's like triage, it's like a clinic, you know? So they can come out and they can explain their proposal, and we can give our advice as to how we can support. So we give that expertise right at the beginning instead of when it's finished. And then there's a tension because they've kind of done all this work, and then we come out and say, well, you can't do that because this will happen, or the police will stop that straight away, you know? So it's now happening at the beginning, which is great. I think it's a really good improvement.
And I also want to say that I think it's inspiring that someone who has worked on murders and these investigations for all his life has taken over like climate movement, because I think it shows the urgency of the climate debate, and that it's equally important for the society, and not just the immediate causes, but also the long-term causes. So it's really inspiring to see someone get involved with this gravity in this movement.
Well, it's weird, isn't it? I used to be, you know, if the phone rang and it was anonymous, somebody said, right, somebody's going to get killed, we wouldn't go home. We'd have to try and sort out something before, you know, before we went home to bed. We'd have to try and do something. And now we haven't got an anonymous phone call. We've got global, unanimous scientific evidence. And it's not one person's life threatened. It's millions, possibly billions of people's lives threatened right now, you know. So it's a no-brainer, really.
You're dealing with the real criminals.
Yeah, with lots of money.
Government.
Yeah, true. But the one thing I mentioned to you, Anka, was the problem we have with the police now, and police liaison, is that when I came into this, the whole idea was that we tell the police what we're going to do, and then they have a dilemma, and they have to decide whether they're going to facilitate the protest or try and get rid of us and arrest everybody. And then if they arrest everybody, they have 3,000 arrested, you know? So that was the dilemma. Brilliant. You know, that was a fantastic coup. But my job as police liaison was often, you know, telling the police, why don't you facilitate this? You can cut down the number of police you use. We can have our protest. We can deliver our message to the government. And you only use maybe 10% of the amount of police that you'd use otherwise. And it's all nice and loving, and, you know, you're on board with us, and we're never violent. We never cause a problem. You know, that was my job. But that's exactly what's happened in Bristol. And in Bristol, they can't get in the newspapers because there's never any confrontation. So they are pulling their hair out because they can't get the police to react, which is, you know, that's our own dilemma now, isn't it? So what do we do I mean, unless we're going to punch them in the face and get violent, it's very difficult to know what to do.
Mika, you're on mute.
You're muted.
Yeah, I think it's a clown brigade, or giant puppets, or huge amounts of balloons or things like that.
Yeah,
So yeah, the artistic gestures are impossible to ignore, and they're non-violent.
yeah, I agree. Yeah, I've kind of moved away from massive disruption, because that was great to raise the alarm with people in the street, because they didn't know, but now everybody knows. So you just piss them off. And a lot of people are under extreme stress from COVID and trying to get food on the table. So I'm not really into disruptive actions. I think artistic ones are better.
Yeah, maybe Museum of Care and Extinction Rebellion can organize a Zoom sometimes, and we can all brainstorm,
Yeah.
and come up with some ideas that's maybe we all can use. So let's meet next week if you have time. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was thinking to tell Paul if he wants to join our Museum of Care meetings. I will send you
Yeah.
the link. Okay.
Yeah. So nice to meet you. Thank you so
And
much.
yeah.
Nice
And
to
if
meet
you
you, Paul.
send me a link so I know exactly what you're doing, that would be great. As in,
Okay.
not in a creepy way. I didn't mean that. Not in a creepy proper way. I mean, but lovely to meet you all.
Nice to
Yes.
meet you. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.